March 14, 1622. The colonial estate of Don Francisco Velázquez lies in ruins outside Mexico City. Spanish authorities arrived to find the nobleman's body trampled beyond recognition in his own stable. His prized black stallion, the legendary warhorse that survived the conquest of Tenochtitlan, stands motionless in the corner, its eyes reflecting an intelligence that makes seasoned soldiers cross themselves in fear. This is the third owner to die in possession of this animal in just 3 years, each death more violent than the last, each preceded by the same warning, strange symbols appearing on the stable walls, written in what investigators will later identify as ancient Nahuatl, the language of the Aztec Empire. But the truth was far more terrifying than anyone in New Spain could have imagined. Before we uncover the truth about the cursed warhorse that terrorized colonial Mexico, make sure to subscribe to Fear Sermon and ring that notification bell so you never miss our deep dives into history's darkest corners. Drop a comment below telling us where you're watching from. We love hearing from our community of mystery seekers around the world. To understand this story, we must travel back to 1519, a century after Columbus first reached the Americas. The Spanish conquest of the Aztec Empire was reaching its brutal climax. Hernán Cortés and his conquistadors laid siege to Tenochtitlan, the magnificent island capital that would become Mexico City. The siege lasted 93 days. When it ended, an estimated 240,000 Aztec people lay dead from violence, starvation, and European diseases. The Spanish victory seemed absolute. They melted down golden artifacts into bars. They burned codices, the sacred books containing centuries of Aztec knowledge. They built Catholic churches over demolished pyramids. Within a generation, they believed they had erased an entire civilization. But beneath the surface of colonial society, something older persisted. In the decade following the conquest, Spanish authorities began receiving disturbing reports from rural estates. Livestock dying in peculiar patterns. Horses, animals the indigenous people had never seen before the Spanish arrival, found mutilated in ways that served no practical purpose. Colonial administrators dismissed these incidents as the work of resentful natives engaging in petty sabotage. They were wrong. By 1615, New Spain had settled into an uneasy equilibrium. Spanish nobility controlled vast encomiendas, land grants that came with the forced labor of indigenous populations. Mexico City had transformed from Aztec capital to colonial showcase, with European-style buildings rising along streets that still followed the ancient causeways. The Spanish population numbered around 15,000, vastly outnumbered by an indigenous population that exceeded 1 million. Within this world lived Captain Rodrigo de Mendoza, a now aging conquistador who had fought in the original siege. He was 73 years old in 1619, one of the last living veterans of Cortés's campaigns. His estate, located in the fertile valley of Chalco southeast of Mexico City, sprawled across lands that once belonged to Aztec nobility. Mendoza's most prized possession was his warhorse, a massive black stallion he called Tormenta, meaning storm. This animal had carried him through the conquest, surviving arrows, spears, and the chaos of urban warfare. Horses had been crucial to Spanish victory. The Aztecs initially believed horse and rider were a single supernatural being. Even after understanding the truth, indigenous warriors feared these animals whose size and speed could shatter infantry formations. Tormenta was more than a horse to Mendoza. The animal represented his glory days, his survival, his conquest of an empire. He kept the stallion in a specially built stable, refusing to breed the horse or put it to work. At 24 years old, ancient for a warhorse, Tormenta should have been declining. Instead, stable hands whispered that the animal seemed to grow stronger with age, more aggressive, its eyes reflecting an awareness that made them uncomfortable. What Captain Mendoza didn't know was that someone had been watching his horse for years, watching and waiting. In the indigenous quarters of his estate lived an elderly woman named Xochitl, whose Spanish name was Maria. She was 71 years old, nearly Mendoza's contemporary. But while he had spent the conquest on horseback, cutting down Aztec warriors, she had been a priestess in training at the temple of Huitzilopochtli, the Aztec god of war and the sun. She had witnessed the massacre at the Templo Mayor. She had watched Spanish soldiers murder her teachers, the keepers of sacred knowledge. And she had spent the following decades doing something the Spanish believed impossible, preserving the old religion, the old magic, waiting for the right moment to strike back. The Spanish assumed that with the temples destroyed and the priesthood killed, Aztec spiritual practices would simply vanish. They failed to understand the depth of indigenous knowledge systems, the ways sacred information could be transmitted through seemingly innocent means, through songs sung while grinding corn, through patterns woven into textiles, through stories told to children under the guise of folktales. Xochitl had spent decades identifying which Spanish colonizers had committed the worst atrocities. She had created a list, and at the top of that list was Captain Rodrigo de Mendoza, who had personally killed her brother during the siege of Tenochtitlan. The first sign came on August 13, 1619, exactly 98 years after the fall of Tenochtitlan. Spanish authorities had deliberately avoided commemorating this date, but indigenous communities remembered it with precise, unspoken ceremony. Mendoza's stable master, a Spaniard named Luis Cortés, arrived at dawn to find strange marks covering the wall of Tormenta's stall. They weren't random scratches. They formed elaborate symbols, glyphs that seemed to writhe in the morning light. The symbols were drawn in a reddish-brown substance that Cortés initially assumed was rust from the iron tools. It wasn't rust. Later analysis would determine the substance was a mixture of human blood, crushed obsidian, and copal resin, the exact combination used in pre-conquest Aztec rituals. But in 1619, Cortés simply whitewashed the wall and said nothing to Captain Mendoza, not wanting to seem superstitious or weak. The symbols returned 3 nights later. Same wall. Same reddish-brown substance. This time, Cortés posted a guard, a young Spanish soldier named Pedro who carried a musket and strict orders to shoot any intruder on sight. Pedro lasted until midnight. Workers found him the next morning, unconscious outside the stable, his musket unfired. He claimed he remembered nothing. One moment he was alert, watching the stable door, the next he was waking up in the dirt with the sun in his eyes. The symbols had returned, now covering not just one wall but 3. Cortés finally reported the incidents to Captain Mendoza, who reacted with characteristic conquistador arrogance. He ordered the stable thoroughly cleaned and announced he would personally investigate. That night, Mendoza sat in Tormenta's stall, armed with both musket and sword, determined to catch the saboteur. What happened during those dark hours, no one knows for certain. Mendoza never spoke of it publicly, but his wife later testified that he returned to their house at dawn, his face the color of parchment, his hands shaking so badly he could barely hold his breakfast cup. He ordered the indigenous, workers, all of them, confined to their quarters under guard. He had the stable blessed by Father Domingo, the estate's priest. He even had iron horseshoes blessed and nailed above every entrance. None of it mattered. September 15, 1619. Captain Rodrigo de Mendoza entered Tormenta's stable for his daily inspection. He never came out alive. Workers heard the commotion, the stallions screaming, the thunderous kicking, the captain's shouts that became shrieks. By the time they forced open the stable door, Mendoza lay broken on the floor, his body bearing wounds that went beyond mere animal attack. His chest had been crushed, yes, as one might expect from a horse's hooves, but his face showed deep scratches that angled wrong, and his hands bore burn marks in distinct patterns that matched the symbols on the walls. The investigating magistrate, Don Alonso de Cardenas, documented the scene with bureaucratic precision. His report, preserved in the Archivo General de Indias in Seville, makes for disturbing reading. He noted that Tormenta appeared completely calm after the attack, standing quietly in the corner, not lathered or agitated as one would expect from an animal that had just killed. The horse's hooves showed no blood, no tissue, nothing to indicate it had just trampled a man to death. More disturbingly, Cardenas noted that the symbols on the walls were now complete, where before they had been fragmentary. They now formed what his indigenous interpreter reluctantly identified as a full incantation, a curse calling upon Xochitl the enemy, one of the many aspects of Tezcatlipoca, the Aztec god of night, sorcery, and destiny. The interpreter, a Nahua man named Juan who had been raised by Franciscan monks, begged Cardenas to destroy the horse immediately. He claimed the animal was a Nahualli, a shapeshifter, a vessel for supernatural forces. Cardenas, a rational man educated at the University of Salamanca, dismissed this as native superstition. He ordered the estate inventoried and sold. As for Tormenta, the horse would be auctioned to recover debts. Someone would pay good money for a war horse with such impressive bloodlines. Regardless of this unfortunate incident, someone did. Don Sebastian Lobo purchased Tormenta in October 1619 for an impressive sum of 300 silver pesos. Lobo was a successful merchant who had made his fortune in the silver mines of Zacatecas. He had always wanted to own a true Conquest-era warhorse, seeing it as a symbol of Spanish nobility and power. His friends warned him. Even his wife protested. But Lobo was a man who prided himself on being too educated for superstition. He renamed the horse Diablo, Devil, thinking the fearsome name would impress his associates. He kept the stallion at his Mexico City townhouse, in a stable behind his residence on what is now República de Guatemala Street. The symbols appeared on his walls within a week. If this story is giving you chills, hit that like button and share this with someone who loves dark mysteries that blur the line between history and horror. Let's discover what happens next in this tale of colonial revenge. Don Sebastian Lobo was not a superstitious man. He was a creature of the Enlightenment, a reader of science and philosophy. When the symbols appeared, he had them chemically analyzed. When his servants reported strange sounds from the stable at night, he consulted physicians about mass hysteria. When his horse began exhibiting what witnesses described as impossible behavior, appearing in different parts of the stable instantaneously, moving without making sound, its eyes reflecting candlelight from angles that defied geometry. Lobo documented everything in his journal with clinical precision. That journal would later be entered as evidence in the investigation. Lobo's rational approach lasted exactly 43 days. On November 24, 1619, something broke his certainty. His journal entry from that morning is preserved in the records of the Inquisition Tribunal in Mexico City. The handwriting is barely legible, written with obvious haste. I have seen it. God forgive me, I have seen what wears the horse's shape. It is not an animal, it is not of this world. Last night I witnessed the stallion turn its head completely backward while its body remained facing forward. Its eyes held not animal consciousness but human intelligence, and more than that, divine rage. I saw symbols appear on its hide, glowing faintly in the darkness, written in a script I do not know but somehow understand. They spell out names, Spanish names, a list. My name is third. Lobo fled his house that same day, abandoning the horse, abandoning his property, taking only his wife and children to his sister's hacienda in Puebla. He left instructions with his business partner, Don Miguel Fuentes, to dispose of the animal by any means necessary, sell it, kill it, donate it to the viceroy. He no longer cared. Don Miguel Fuentes was a practical man. He saw an opportunity. If his partner was foolish enough to abandon a valuable warhorse, he would claim it for himself. On December 1, 1619, Fuentes transported Tormenta, he refused to use Lobo's name, Diablo, to his estate in Coyoacán, then a separate village south of Mexico City. The symbols appeared on his walls that same night. Fuentes lasted longer than his predecessors, nearly a full month. He employed indigenous workers who performed limpia ceremonies, cleansing rituals that combined Catholic and pre-Columbian elements. He had a curandera, a traditional healer, examine the horse. She took one look at the animal and fled, refusing payment, refusing to speak, simply making the sign of the cross repeatedly as she ran. Witnesses reported increasingly bizarre phenomena at Fuentes' estate. Servants claimed to hear drumming late at night, rhythmic patterns that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. The horse's hoof prints in the stable dirt would sometimes be found arranged in perfect circles, impossible unless the animal could levitate and spin. Most disturbing were the reports that Tormenta was speaking, not neighing or whinnying, but producing sounds that formed actual words in Nahuatl. Father Domingo, the same priest who had blessed Mendoza's stable, was called to perform an exorcism. The ritual took place on December 27, 1619. Multiple witnesses provided testimony to the Inquisition tribunal about what happened. According to these accounts, Father Domingo entered the stable carrying holy water, a crucifix, and his ritual book. He began the Latin prayers of exorcism. Tormenta stood calmly in the center of the stable, unnaturally still. As Father Domingo's prayers intensified, the symbols on the walls began to glow, first faintly, then brightly enough to illuminate the entire stable with reddish light. Then the horse spoke. Multiple witnesses testified to hearing a voice, deep, resonant, distinctly not animal, emerge from the stallion. It spoke in Nahuatl, but Father Domingo understood it nonetheless, as if the meaning bypassed language entirely. The voice stated that the horse was Nahualli, a divine vessel, and that Spanish prayers held no power over Aztec gods who had ruled this land for 1,000 years before Christ's name was ever spoken in the Americas. Father Domingo fled the stable. He would later testify that the horse's eyes had changed, no longer the dark brown of a normal stallion, but golden, like mirrors catching firelight. He claimed he saw reflected in those eyes not his own face, but the burning temples of Tenochtitlan, the massacre of 1521, the desecration of everything the Aztec people held sacred. Don Miguel Fuentes died on December 30th, 1619, 3 days after the failed exorcism. Unlike Mendoza's death, Fuentes's was not officially blamed on the horse. The official record states he fell from a balcony at his estate, but the circumstances surrounding his fall were never satisfactorily explained. Fuentes was found at dawn on the cobblestones below his second-floor bedroom. His body showed the expected injuries from such a fall but also bore other marks, burns arranged in patterns, deep scratches, and what the investigating physician described as indentations consistent with equine dentition on his shoulders and neck. The bedroom window stood open, though servants swore they had closed and locked it the previous night. In the dirt below the balcony, investigators found hoofprints. They led from the stable, across the courtyard, directly beneath the fatal window. Then they simply stopped, no trail leading away, no indication of how the horse had departed. Most damning of all, when authorities entered Fuentes' stable, Tormenta stood in his usual stall, the gate still locked from the outside. The horse was not lathered, not agitated, but his muzzle bore traces of what analysis later confirmed was human blood. And on the stable wall behind him, one word had been added to the existing symbols, a Spanish word, written in that same reddish-brown substance, completed. The deaths of 3 prominent Spanish colonists in less than 4 months triggered the most extensive criminal investigation in early 17th century New Spain. Viceroy Diego Fernández de Córdoba, Marquis of Guadalcazar, personally ordered an inquiry. He appointed Don Alonso de Cardenas, the same magistrate who had investigated Mendoza's death, to lead a special tribunal with powers superseding normal colonial jurisdiction. Cardenas approached the investigation with admirable thoroughness, if limited imagination. His focus was simple: identify the human perpetrators using the horse as cover for murder. He rejected supernatural explanations out of principle, convinced that rational inquiry would expose a conspiracy of vengeful indigenous people exploiting Spanish superstition. He was both right and catastrophically wrong. The investigation's first phase focused on the horse itself. Cardenas ordered Tormenta destroyed immediately. On January 8, 1620, a squad of 12 soldiers arrived at Fuentes' estate with muskets loaded and orders to shoot the animal on sight. The stable was empty. The gate remained locked from the outside. The walls were solid stone with no gaps. Yet Tormenta had vanished. An extensive search of Coyoacán and surrounding areas found no trace of the stallion. It was as if the horse had simply ceased to exist. Several soldiers later reported, always unofficially, never in written testimony, that they had seen hoofprints leading away from the stable, tracks that glowed faintly red in the afternoon sunlight before fading entirely. These reports were dismissed as stress and superstition. With the horse gone, Cardenas turned his attention to the human element. He ordered the arrest of every indigenous person who had worked on all 3 estates, Mendoza's in Chalco, Lobo's in Mexico City, and Fuentes's in Coyoacán. Over 100 people were detained, held in the viceregal prison, and interrogated using methods we would today classify as torture. The interrogations revealed nothing concrete, but they painted a disturbing picture. Multiple detainees, when questioned separately, told the same story. An elderly indigenous woman had been seen near all 3 estates. They described her as wearing traditional Nahua clothing, rather than the Spanish-style dress most indigenous people had adopted. She carried a woven bag containing unknown items. She hummed old songs, pre-conquest songs that few still remembered. Most significantly, multiple witnesses identified her as Xochitl, the woman who had worked on Mendoza's estate. But when soldiers went to arrest her, they found only an empty room in the estate's servants' quarters. She had disappeared along with the horse. Cardenas pursued this lead with obsessive determination. He traced Xochitl's history through baptismal records, estate documents, and interviews with surviving elderly indigenous people who remembered the conquest. What he discovered disturbed even his rational mind. Xochitl had been born around 1548, making her approximately 72 years old in 1620. Church records showed she had been baptized in 1522, immediately after the conquest, taking the Christian name Maria. But witnesses testified that she had been a priestess in training at the Templo Mayor before its destruction, a position that would have required extensive training in ritual practices, including what Spanish priests categorized as sorcery and witchcraft. Cardenas located several elderly Nahua people who remembered her from before the conquest. Their testimonies, preserved in the tribunal records, provide rare glimpses into Aztec religious practices. They described Xochitl as a Nahualli, a practitioner who could transform into animal form, who could communicate with the spirit world, who possessed knowledge of sacred rituals that could bridge the gap between human and divine realms. More concerning to Spanish authorities, these witnesses claimed Xochitl had never stopped practicing the old religion. For nearly a century, she had maintained secret ceremonies, preserved forbidden knowledge, and waited for the right moment to strike back at those who had destroyed her world. The tribunal's findings grew more troubling as Cardenas dug deeper. He discovered that all three victims, Mendoza, Lobo, and Fuentes, shared specific characteristics. All had participated in the conquest or profited directly from it. All had committed documented atrocities against indigenous people. And all three names appeared in what Cardenas termed the death list. This list surfaced during the interrogation of an elderly indigenous man named Tomas, who claimed to have been a child during the conquest. Under intense questioning, he revealed that certain elders maintained secret records, memories preserved through oral tradition and hidden codices, of Spanish individuals marked for spiritual retribution. Cardenas never found these records. Despite extensive searches, despite offering immunity to informants, despite threatening entire communities, the supposed codices remained hidden, if they existed at all. The investigation took a darker turn when Cardenas began experiencing his own unexplained phenomena. His personal journal, discovered centuries later in Spanish archives, records increasingly disturbed entries from March 1620 onward. He reported seeing hoofprints appearing in his office overnight, hearing horse sounds echoing through the viceregal palace's stone corridors, finding symbols drawn on his chamber walls in that same reddish-brown substance. On April 3, 1620, Cardenas abruptly closed the investigation. His official report, filed with the viceroy, concluded that the three deaths were tragic accidents with no evidence of criminal conspiracy. He recommended releasing all detained indigenous people and ceasing further inquiry. The report mentioned nothing about curses, nothing about Xochitl, nothing about supernatural phenomena. Cardenas retired from public service immediately afterward. He returned to Spain in 1621, where he died in 1623 under circumstances his family refused to discuss. The only clue comes from a letter his widow sent to the Archbishop of Seville, requesting special prayers for her husband's soul. In it, she mentioned that he had been pursued by demons from the New World and had died in terror, claiming to see the eyes of the Black Horse everywhere he looked. The Spanish colonial administration attempted to suppress the entire story. Official histories made no mention of the cursed war horse. The Inquisition classified all related documents as secret, accessible only to high-ranking church officials. Indigenous people were forbidden, under pain of death, from discussing Xochitl or the incidents of 1619 to 1620. But suppression only strengthened the legend. Among indigenous communities, the story of Xochitl and the Nahualli horse became a powerful counter-narrative to Spanish dominance. It proved that the old gods had not abandoned their people, that Spanish power was not absolute, that resistance, even if only spiritual, remained possible. The case of Tormenta the warhorse and Xochitl the Nahualli priestess resonated far beyond its immediate circumstances. It represented a collision between two fundamentally incompatible worldviews, the Spanish Christian cosmos and the Aztec sacred universe. More importantly, it revealed the limitations of colonial power and the persistence of indigenous spiritual resistance. Spanish authorities had assumed that with military conquest came complete cultural dominance. They believed that by destroying temples, burning codices, and killing priests, they could erase Aztec religion entirely within a single generation. The events of 1619 to 1620 demonstrated how catastrophically they had underestimated the resilience of indigenous knowledge systems. Oral tradition, it turned out, was nearly impossible to suppress. While written codices could be burned, stories transmitted through songs, ceremony, and family teachings survived hidden in plain sight. Spanish authorities might control what was written and what was publicly performed, but they could not control what grandmothers whispered to grandchildren, what patterns women wove into textiles, what meanings were encoded in seemingly innocent folk songs. The story had immediate political consequences. In 1621, the Spanish crown issued new decrees requiring more stringent monitoring of indigenous populations. Estate owners were ordered to hire Spanish overseers to supervise all indigenous workers, especially elderly individuals who might remember pre-conquest times. The penalties for practicing native sorcery were increased to mandatory execution. These measures, predictably, failed. If anything, they drove indigenous spiritual practices deeper underground, making them harder to detect but no less prevalent. What the Spanish refused to understand was that they weren't fighting an organized rebellion they could suppress through force. They were confronting something far more powerful, a people's refusal to forget their own history, their own sacred knowledge, their own gods. The horse itself was never found. Over the subsequent decades, reports surfaced periodically of a black stallion appearing near sites of Spanish atrocities. In 1635, witnesses claimed to see such a horse at the site of the Cholula massacre, where Spanish conquistadors had killed thousands of indigenous people in 1519. In 1648, a similar horse was reported near the ruins of the Templo Mayor on the anniversary of Tenochtitlan's fall. Each sighting was accompanied by the mysterious death of a Spanish colonist, deaths that authorities officially attributed to natural causes or accidents, never to supernatural vengeance. These accounts, dismissed by Spanish authorities as superstitious fabrications, were meticulously preserved in indigenous oral traditions. Anthropologists studying Nahuatl communities in the 20th century collected dozens of variations of the story of the revenge horse, each adding local details but maintaining the core narrative, a Nahualli priestess who channeled the spirit of conquest itself into a war horse, turning Spanish military superiority against the conquistadors themselves. The case also influenced how the Spanish Inquisition approached indigenous spiritual practices. Prior to 1619, inquisitors had largely treated native superstitions as misguided ignorance rather than genuine threat. After Cardenas's investigation, church authorities began taking indigenous spirituality far more seriously and far more dangerously. Trials for witchcraft and sorcery increased dramatically in New Spain after 1620. Indigenous healers, midwives, and anyone suspected of maintaining pre-conquest knowledge became targets. The Inquisition developed specific protocols for identifying Nahuales and other practitioners of what they termed demonic transformation arts. Hundreds of indigenous people, mostly elderly and mostly women, were imprisoned, tortured, and executed throughout the 1620s and 1630s. Yet this persecution, brutal as it was, could not eliminate the underlying belief systems. Anthropological research in modern Mexico demonstrates clear continuity between pre-Columbian Aztec spiritual practices and contemporary indigenous traditions. Nahuales still exist in Nahua communities today, though they practice with understandable secrecy. The concept of animal transformation, of spirit communication, of maintaining relationships with pre-Christian sacred forces, all of these have survived 500 years of suppression. The story of Xochitl and Tormenta also reveals something profound about the nature of colonization itself. The Spanish conquered territory and bodies, but they never fully conquered souls or memories. Every colonial power throughout history has discovered this same limitation. You can occupy land, you can enforce laws, you can demand outward compliance, but you cannot colonize belief itself. What happened to Xochitl remains unknown. She was never captured, never confirmed dead. Some contemporary accounts claim she was seen in indigenous communities as far south as Oaxaca in the 1620s, still elderly but somehow not aging further, still carrying her woven bag, still humming old songs. Other stories say she transformed permanently into animal form, choosing to live as a coyote or an eagle rather than in human shape under Spanish rule. The most persistent legend claims she returned to the ruins of the Templo Mayor on the night of August 13, 1620. Exactly 1 year after the curse began, and simply vanished into the earth itself, returning to Mictlan, the Aztec underworld, to report her success to the gods who had sent her. These stories, impossible to verify, served an important function for indigenous communities. They preserved a narrative of successful resistance in a time when open rebellion was suicidal. If physical resistance was impossible, spiritual resistance remained. If they could not defeat Spanish armies, they could at least maintain the belief that Spanish power was not absolute, that divine justice, Aztec justice, still operated in the world. The case fundamentally challenged Spanish assumptions about the nature of their colonial project. They had framed conquest as a civilizing mission, bringing Christianity and European culture to savage peoples. But cases like this forced them to confront uncomfortable questions. What if the indigenous peoples possessed their own valid spiritual systems? What if their gods were not merely false idols, but actual supernatural forces? What if the conquest had not been divinely ordained but simply successful violence? Spanish theologians and administrators never publicly acknowledged these questions, but private correspondence from the period reveals deep anxiety. Church officials worried about whether their presence in the Americas was truly serving God's will or merely Spanish imperial ambitions. Military commanders privately expressed fear about operating in lands where the very stones remember our crimes, as one letter put it. The story of the Conquistador's warhorse remains one of the most unsettling episodes in colonial Mexican history. 3 prominent Spanish colonists died under mysterious circumstances in rapid succession. An elderly indigenous woman with knowledge of pre-conquest religious practices vanished without a trace. A legendary warhorse that should have been a symbol of Spanish military superiority instead became the instrument of that dominance turned against itself. What do you think really happened in those stables in 1619? Was Xochitl a genuine Nahualli who successfully cursed a warhorse using Aztec magic? Or was she a clever woman who used psychological manipulation and Spanish superstition to orchestrate revenge for her people? Could there be a rational explanation for all the documented phenomena, the symbols, the impossible hoofprints, the horse's reported behavior? Or do some events simply defy rational explanation? Leave your theories in the comments below. Tell us, do you believe in curses, or do you think there's always a logical explanation? Have you heard similar stories about supernatural revenge in your own family histories or local traditions? And here's a question that haunts historians and anthropologists to this day. How many other acts of spiritual resistance like this occurred throughout colonial Latin America, but were successfully suppressed, their stories lost to history? How much indigenous agency and resistance have we simply failed to recognize because it operated outside European frameworks of understanding? Subscribe to Fear Sermon for more lost chapters of history, where the line between the natural and supernatural becomes impossible to define. Ring that notification bell so you never miss our deep dives into the darkness that lurks in historical records. Share this with someone who loves stories that challenge our assumptions about what's possible. The conquest of the Americas was never as complete as the colonizers believed. Beneath the churches and Spanish architecture, older forces waited. And sometimes, just sometimes, those forces struck back. See you in the next video.